He thought he had seen just an ordinary piece of trash on the shore, but the strange black object turned out to be far more mysterious. When it was opened, what was inside terrified everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning began with the soft call of seabirds echoing over the narrow strip of coast where the village clung to the land like a secret. Drowsy light slipped through the mist and spread across the waves, giving the world a pale silver glow. The sea, endless and patient, whispered against the stones, and the air carried that strong scent of salt and dampness that only fishermen's families truly grew to love. For most of the villagers, mornings were a time of labor, but for young David, they were a time of wonder. He was 12 years old, slender and wiry, with dark skin that glistened in the early light, and eyes that were always searching. His father was already at sea, like most of the men of the village, but David rarely joined him. His world was the shoreline, the long stretches of sand, mossy rocks, and the mysteries that the waves cast up from unknown places. He had formed a habit, one that his mother both worried about and quietly admired, of rising before the others and slipping out barefoot onto the beach. There he would wander, not to fish or to gather anything useful, but to explore. He would crouch among the wet stones, sift through driftwood, study the skeletons of fish, or pocket fragments of glass worn smooth by the tide. The villagers often shook their heads, saying he wasted his time. But David felt that the beach belonged to him in those quiet hours, that the world gave up its secrets only when he was alone. That morning, the sky was still pale, streaked with long gray clouds, and the sand was cool under his feet. He walked along the tide line, listening to the hush and sigh of the water. He thought about his father out there on the ocean, about the heavy nets and the pull of fish, and wondered if someday he would be asked to go too. But for now, his heart was more interested in the strange and the forgotten than in hauling baskets of slippery silver creatures. His eyes darted from one patch of shore to another, scanning the familiar chaos of seaweed and shells. It was then, near a cluster of damp stones mottled with moss, that something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was simply another boulder half buried in the shallows, but the way it gleamed under the morning light made him pause. He slowed his steps, tilting his head, and squinted. The object was darker than the rocks around it, a strange shade of black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He felt a flicker of unease in his stomach as he crept closer. The thing was round, unnaturally so, and larger than he was, though not perfectly smooth. Its surface glistened with moisture and was broken by patches of barnacles clinging stubbornly to the metal. For metal, it clearly was. His instincts told him so at once. The upper side rose from the water like the dome of a sunken world, and at its very top, a rusted ring protruded, thick and solid, as though once used to anchor or lift it. For a moment, David simply stared, his bare feet sinking into the wet moss under him. He could hear the faint creak of water lapping against its side. He felt an irrational shiver run through him. The stories he had heard as whispers among the older men came back suddenly, the ones about bombs and mines left from the time of war. They said that long ago ships had sailed these waters with hidden cargo, and that sometimes the sea gave back what had been forgotten. His heart began to thud in his chest as he imagined what would happen if he touched it and it exploded. Yet there was something more than fear that gripped him. There was fascination. He bent, his breath shallow, and picked up a long stick lying nearby. Edging closer, he reached out and nudged the object gently. It rocked ever so slightly under his touch, shifting against the stones and sending a ripple across the shallow water. The sound it made, a dull, hollow echo, sent a jolt of excitement through him. It was not a rock at all. It was something built, something hidden, something the sea had kept secret until now. David stood very still, listening to the water and the birds above, waiting to see if anything would happen. The sphere did not move again, but his pulse still raced. A part of him wanted to run back to the safety of his mother's kitchen, to pretend he had seen nothing. But another part told him this was what he had always been searching for during his aimless walks. He had always dreamed of finding something more than shells and driftwood, something that mattered. He was certain now that he had. The boy crouched closer, peering at the strange shapes etched into the surface. They were not clear carvings, but the way barnacles and rust had formed left patterns that almost looked deliberate, like faded markings. He reached out his hand but stopped short, his fingers hovering above the wet, cold metal. He pulled back quickly, uneasy. The sea surged, splashing softly against the rocks, and for a moment, David imagined the object breathing, alive in some silent way, as though the ocean itself had chosen to show it to him and no one else. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and took a step back. He looked around. There was no one inside. The village was still asleep behind him. His instincts told him he could not leave this unspoken. He needed to tell someone, though he feared what they might say. If it was dangerous, would they blame him for finding it? If it was valuable, would someone else take it from him? The thought tightened his chest, but he was only a boy, and the weight of the unknown was too heavy to carry alone. David stood there, staring at the strange sphere, until the tide surged high enough to cover its lower half again. He turned at last, his heart pounding, and began to walk quickly back toward the village. His feet slapped against the damp sand, his breath ragged. He knew that whatever this was, it would change things. Perhaps not today, perhaps not even tomorrow. But he felt deep inside that he had uncovered something far larger than himself. When he reached the path leading up to the cluster of wooden houses, he glanced back one last time. The sphere was still there, black and immovable, as if waiting. He shivered, unsure whether it was watching him leave or calling him back. Then he broke into a run, heading home to find the words to tell what he had seen, though he already sensed that the moment he spoke them, the world he knew would never be the same again. David's breath had not yet steadied by the time he burst through the doorway of the small wooden house where his family lived. The smell of fish hung in the air, mingling with the smoke of the hearth where his mother prepared the morning meal. She turned at once, startled by his expression, but before she could scold him for running in like a storm, he blurted out his news. His words came too fast, tumbling over one another, half-formed, but the urgency in his eyes left no doubt that he had seen something beyond the ordinary. His mother frowned and placed a hand on his shoulder, demanding he slow down, that he explain himself properly. When at last she understood, her face drained of color. She had lived near the sea all her life and had heard enough tales from her own father to know that objects left behind by the ocean could bring danger as well as mystery. Her first instinct was to forbid David to go near it again, to keep him safe within the walls of their house, but she knew that words alone could not smother the fire of curiosity once lit. It was David's grandfather, an old man whose face was lined by decades of wind and salt, who took the boy seriously. Marco had been a sailor in his youth, had traveled farther than anyone in their little village, and had seen things the others only whispered about. When David told him what he had found, Describing the round shape and the metal surface, Marco's brows drew together. He did not laugh, nor did he dismiss it as the boy's imagination. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane, and said they must see it for themselves. The boy's excitement mingled with relief. At least someone believed him. By mid-morning, word had spread. A few fishermen who had returned from sea, their nets heavy with the morning's catch, joined Marco and David on the walk to the shore. Their boots squelched in the damp sand, and the chatter among them grew louder with each step. When, at last, they reached the place where the tide had withdrawn and revealed the dark curve of the object, the men fell silent. Even the most skeptical among them felt the weight of its presence. There it lay, half buried in the rocks, glistening with seawater, its strange ring catching the light like an eye watching them. They circled it carefully, none daring to touch it, whispering theories in low voices. One declared it a sea mine left from a forgotten war, warning that it could explode if disturbed. Another suggested it was part of a ship's engine, torn loose in a storm and carried here by the currents. Yet another muttered about secret cargoes, smuggled goods, even treasure hidden by men who had never returned to claim it. The uncertainty fed their imaginations, and the longer they stared, the more ominous the object seemed. When they returned to the village, the arguments began. Some insisted it must be reported to the authorities at once, before harm befell anyone. Others warned against it, saying outsiders would come and take control, leaving the villagers with nothing but trouble. The women grew anxious, whispering about curses, about the wrath of the sea if men disturbed what it had chosen to conceal. Children were forbidden to play near the rocks, though that only made them more eager to sneak off and see for themselves the thing that had unsettled their parents. By evening, the object was the only subject of conversation. In the narrow lanes between the houses, men debated heatedly, their voices carrying above the crash of waves. Some laughed nervously, trying to make light of it, while others spoke in grave tones, reminding their neighbors of old tales. Marco, silent through much of it, smoked his pipe by the fire and listened. David sat close, his small hands gripping his knees, caught between pride and fear. Pride, because he had found it first. Fear, because he felt the responsibility growing heavier with each rumor that spread. The next morning, more people went to see the object, drawn by curiosity despite their misgivings. Some kept their distance, crossing themselves or muttering prayers, while others studied it boldly, speculating about its origins. The fishermen measured its size with their eyes, imagining how it could have drifted, how long it had been in the water. The oldest among them shook their heads, claiming that never in all their years had they seen something like it wash ashore. A few believed it was a gift from the sea, a sign of fortune, while others whispered that it was a warning. In time, the atmosphere in the village changed. Normal routines seemed overshadowed. Nets were still cast, fish were still gutted and salted, but all conversations turned back to the sphere. Children invented stories about it being an egg from a sea monster, waiting to hatch. Some women refused to let their husbands go near it again, fearing calamity. For David, the days stretched long, filled with anticipation and dread. He felt a strange bond with the object as though it belonged to him alone, because he had discovered it, and yet it had slipped from his grasp into the hands of the entire village. At night, he lay awake listening to the sea, wondering if the tide would claim it back, whether he would wake to find it gone. Sometimes he wished it would vanish, taking the burden with it. Other times he imagined opening it himself and uncovering secrets no one else had the courage to face. He was only a boy, yet he felt older now, his world expanded and darkened by the presence of that silent, immovable shape on the shore. The rumors did not fade. Instead, they grew, feeding upon themselves until they took on a life of their own. By the end of the week, there were whispers of men in distant towns who might pay handsomely for such a find, and warnings of soldiers who would come and seize it by force. The villagers began to look at one another with suspicion, worried that someone might already have sent word beyond the hills. The air grew tense, brittle as dried nets in the sun. David noticed how his grandfather watched the horizon with narrowed eyes, how his mother grew quieter, her hands restless as she worked. He sensed that change was coming, though he did not know what form it would take. He returned often to the shore, standing at a distance and staring at the black curve of the object, and each time he felt the same shiver of awe. It was as if the sea had placed a riddle at their feet, daring them to solve it, and the village had become a place suspended between fear and hope. By then, David understood that nothing would ever be the same again. He had found something far greater than driftwood and seashells, something that stirred not only his own imagination, but the hearts of everyone around him. And though he tried to cling to the quiet innocence of his morning walks, he knew that the simple days of searching alone by the waves had ended. The sphere had entered their lives, and with it had come a storm that no one could yet see, but all could feel. The days that followed were heavy with unease. The villagers could not shake the sense that the strange black sphere on their shore was more than just a curiosity. The rumors had swollen until they seemed almost tangible, filling the air like mist. Some said the sea had spat out a weapon meant to remain hidden in its depths. Others insisted it was treasure, a forgotten cache of gold or jewels that war had swallowed decades ago. Still, others whispered of curses, of things best left untouched. And yet, for all their words, no one dared move it or disturb it further. The sphere remained where it was, dark and patient, as though watching them while the tides washed over it each day. It was on a gray morning, when the mist clung stubbornly to the hills and the gulls wheeled silently above the harbor, that the sound of engines came. The villagers heard it first as a distant growl, out of place in their quiet settlement where only the creak of boats and the rush of waves usually filled their ears. Heads turned as two vehicles rolled into the village, their tires crunching over gravel. One was a heavy truck, old but well kept, the other a low Jeep with dark windows. They stopped near the edge of the path that led down toward the sea, and men climbed out, their boots striking the ground with a deliberate rhythm. They wore no uniforms, no symbols of authority, yet there was something in their bearing that made them seem official. Their clothes were plain, practical, jackets suited to travel, trousers tucked into boots, but their movements were precise, measured. They spoke little to one another, their faces serious, their eyes sharp as they scanned the surroundings. A hush fell across the village as people gathered at a distance, staring. The strangers did not smile, nor did they greet the onlookers. They walked directly toward the path to the beach as though they already knew what they had come for. David stood among the crowd, pressed between his mother and grandfather. His heart thudded in his chest. He knew instantly they had come for the sphere. His discovery, his secret morning ritual that had turned into the obsession of the whole village, was no longer theirs alone. Outsiders had arrived, and the object would be in their hands now. A mixture of pride and dread swirled inside him. Pride that he had been the first to see it. Dread that he was about to watch it slip into the control of others. The men descended to the rocks without hesitation. They carried with them small cases which they set down beside the sphere. One of them knelt and brushed away the moss clinging to its side, revealing more of the metal beneath. Another produced a device with dials and held it against the surface, watching the needles tremble. The villagers murmured nervously. To them, it looked like sorcery, though they knew it was only science. A few men in the crowd stepped forward, asking questions, but the strangers ignored them or answered with clipped words, vague and unsatisfying. After a time, one of the men produced a camera and began to take photographs, circling the object slowly, capturing it from every angle. The sound of the shutter clicking echoed strangely in the damp air. Another drew notes into a leather-bound book, pausing often to measure the circumference with a steel tape. Their actions were efficient, practiced, as though this was not the first time they had encountered something like this. The villagers exchanged anxious glances. The stranger's silence was worse than any explanation could have been. When the men finished their examination, they conferred quietly among themselves. Then, without warning, they began setting up stakes and rope, marking off a perimeter around the object. A wooden sign was planted at the edge, painted hastily with a single word: dangerous. The villagers murmured louder now, indignant. This was their land, their beach. Who were these men to come without introduction, to fence off part of their home? Yet no one dared challenge them outright. Something about the authority in their movements made resistance feel futile. David watched as two of the strangers adjusted the ropes, enclosing the sphere like a captured beast. He clenched his fists, his small chest rising and falling quickly. He felt betrayed, though he could not say by whom, by the men who had come, by his own grandfather who had spoken of it to others, or by the sea itself, which had given him this secret only to take it away. The villagers shuffled uneasily, their whispers sharper now, but none approached the men. The strangers seemed not to notice the growing unease, or perhaps they did not care. As the sun climbed higher, the men packed away their instruments. Without ceremony, they returned to their vehicles and drove away, leaving behind the ropes, the sign, and the weight of unanswered questions. The villagers remained, gathered near the beach, staring at the fenced-off sphere as if it had become something even more alien than before. It no longer belonged to them, nor did it belong to the sea. It had been claimed by outsiders, though they had taken nothing with them. The silence it left was heavier than the roar of the departing engines. That evening, the village was alive with argument. Men slammed their fists on tables, demanding to know what the strangers intended. Women worried about their children, forbidding them from wandering near the beach at all. Some said the men had been soldiers in disguise, others that they were treasure hunters who would return under cover of darkness. Marco sat quietly by the fire, smoking his pipe, his eyes narrowed. David, sitting at his feet, could feel the tension in the old man's stillness. He wanted desperately to ask what he thought, to beg him for answers, but he held his tongue. He had learned enough to know that sometimes silence carried more truth than words. In the days that followed, the strangers returned only briefly, checking their ropes, studying the sphere again, and then vanishing just as quickly. They never spoke to the villagers, never explained themselves. The rope barrier remained, flapping in the wind, a stark reminder that the sphere was no longer theirs to touch. The fishermen muttered that their shore had been stolen, that soon they would lose even more. Others whispered that perhaps it was for the best, that the object was dangerous and should be left to those who understood such things. But the distrust lingered, gnawing at the edges of daily life. For David, the change was sharp and bitter. He still walked near the beach when he could, but always he found himself stopped at the rope, staring at the object that had once been his alone. It seemed smaller now, caged, robbed of its mystery. Yet he felt more drawn to it than ever, as though the stranger's claim had only deepened his bond to it. He wondered what they had discovered in their quiet measurements, what secrets they had seen in its rusted shell. And each night, as he lay awake listening to the sea, he dreamed of slipping past the ropes and uncovering its truth himself, no matter the cost. What David could not know, what none of the villagers could know, was that the arrival of those strangers was only the beginning. Their presence had stirred something far larger than the village, something that reached beyond the hills and the sea, into places where decisions were made that ordinary people would never glimpse. The ropes and the warning sign were only the first shadow of what was to come. The boy felt it in his bones, even if he could not put it into words. The world had shifted the moment those engines were heard, and the beach would never again be just a place for shells and driftwood. The strangers had left their ropes, their warning signs, and their silence, and though they had gone, their shadow lingered heavy across the village. Life resumed its rhythms. Boats still set out at dawn, nets still dragged silver fish across the harbor stones, but the talk never strayed far from the fenced-off sphere at the beach. The children whispered of it in games. The women spoke of it with lowered voices as they cleaned fish or scrubbed laundry, and the men argued fiercely about what should be done. Yet no one crossed the ropes. No one dared disturb what had been claimed. The sphere had become something both forbidden and irresistible. It was David who first noticed the change. He had taken to slipping out at night, restless with curiosity that burned stronger with each day. The moonlight lay silver over the water, and the village slept, but from the path that led toward the beach he saw faint flickers of light where there should have been only darkness. At first he thought it was his imagination, some trick of the stars or the lanterns of late fishermen, but as he crept closer the truth became undeniable. The strangers had returned under cover of night. He crouched among the rocks, holding his breath, the cold air pricking his skin. Below, on the shore, men moved with quiet precision. They wore darker clothes now, and their lanterns were hooded, cast in narrow beams that barely reached the ground. The ropes and signs they had planted for the villagers remained untouched, but inside that boundary they worked freely, as though the beach belonged to them alone. David could hear the scrape of metal against metal, the muffled clatter of tools being unpacked. They were doing something to the sphere, something they had not dared attempt in daylight. He watched as one of the men knelt by the side of the object, fastening clamps onto its curved surface. Another carried a box that hummed faintly, its wires trailing to a device that glowed with weak green light. They spoke rarely, and when they did their voices were low, but the boy caught fragments, measurements, adjustments, words he did not understand. From time to time they stopped, consulting papers or maps spread out on the sand, before returning to their work with renewed urgency. The sphere seemed different under their attention. In the dim light it gleamed wetly, its barnacle-crusted surface casting jagged shadows. David thought it almost breathed, each sound from their instruments making it stir like a creature disturbed from slumber. When one of the men struck it lightly with a tool, a deep hollow resonance rolled out, so strange and heavy that it seemed to shake the stones beneath the boy's feet. He shuddered, pressing himself closer to the rock, afraid they might hear his heartbeat. Hours passed. David's eyes grew heavy, but he could not leave. He watched as they attached cables, as they pried gently at the seams of rust, as though searching for a way inside. At last, a muffled click rang out, and a narrow line of darkness appeared on the sphere's surface. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The men froze for a moment, then worked faster, widening the gap until a section of the sphere shifted slightly outward. There was a hatch, a hidden panel he had never noticed. His skin prickled as he realized the object was not just some relic of war or chance wreckage. It had been built to open. The strangers bent over the gap, using their lights to probe the interior. Their shoulders blocked his view, but he saw one of them reach inside and withdraw a small sealed container. It was box-like, metallic, its edges sharp, its lid bound with clasps. Another followed, then another. They placed them carefully into cases lined with cloth, treating them as though they were precious or dangerous. David longed to know what was inside. Treasure, weapons, secrets, but the men kept their backs to him, silent guardians of the mystery. When the containers had been secured, the men sealed the hatch again. They did not lock it fully, David noticed. The rusted seam still showed faintly under the moonlight, as though marked for return. They lifted their cases, heavy and unwieldy, and carried them toward the waiting jeep, hidden in the shadows farther up the path. The boy ducked low as they passed, his heart hammering in his chest. He could smell the faint tang of oil and salt on their clothes as they trudged by, their boots sinking into the wet sand. Then they were gone, swallowed by the night, leaving only the ropes, the warning sign, and the sphere behind. David remained crouched long after the last sound of engines had faded into silence. His mind whirled with questions he could not answer. What had they taken? Why had they worked in darkness and secrecy? Why not in daylight, when the village could see? He thought of his grandfather, of the fishermen, of the worried faces of the women, and knew they would not believe him if he told them what he had witnessed. They would think it the imagination of a child. Yet he had seen it with his own eyes. The sphere had a door, and inside it lay something important enough to steal in the dead of night. He stumbled home as the horizon paled, his body chilled, his thoughts fevered. Sleep evaded him. He lay awake, listening to the gulls cry out their morning chorus, the smell of his mother's cooking drifting into his room, and he felt older than he had the day before. The secret he carried weighed heavier than his small shoulders could bear, but he knew he would carry it alone if he had to. The next night he returned, unable to resist. Again he saw the glow of lanterns, heard the murmur of voices, the faint grind of metal. The strangers came back each night, always after the village had gone to bed, always working quickly, carefully, carrying away more containers and sealed bundles. The fishermen noticed lights on the water, too, boats drifting offshore with strange equipment glinting on their decks. From a distance, they looked like ordinary vessels, but those who watched closely swore the men aboard were not fishing. They were working with wires and machines, their shadows hunched over mysterious devices. Whispers spread through the village like wildfire. The women claimed the sea itself was angry, that the strangers had stirred something best left alone. The men argued bitterly, torn between confronting them and avoiding trouble. Some said the object should be destroyed, others that it should be guarded. Yet none dared cut the ropes or approach while the strangers were there. Fear held them back. Fear and the sense that these were matters beyond their understanding. For David, each night deepened the mystery. He felt both terrified and exhilarated, drawn to the secret as surely as the tide was drawn to the shore. He imagined what might happen if he himself slipped inside that hatch, if he were the one to open the containers and read their contents. The thought filled him with longing. He began to sense that his life was changing, that he had stumbled into a story larger than the village, larger than himself, something tied to the hidden currents of history. By the end of the week, the village no longer slept easily. Even those who pretended indifference could not ignore the glow of lights along the water, the low hum of engines, the shadows moving in the night. It was clear to all that the strangers were not finished. They had come for something more than what they had already taken. And though no one knew what it was, the knowledge gnawed at them, leaving the entire community restless, waiting for the next revelation. David, standing once more in the darkness with his heart racing, knew only this. The sphere was not what it seemed, and the men who had claimed it were not to be trusted. The secret was larger, darker, and closer than he had ever imagined, and he would not rest until he discovered it for himself. David had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the strangers' work, the way their lights flickered at the edge of the tide when the rest of the world lay in sleep. Night after night he crept from his bed, his feet moving silently across the floorboards, his breath held tight in his chest as he pushed the door open with care. The village was never truly silent. There were always the sighs of the ocean, the lowing of animals from their pens, the restless cry of a gull in the dark. But in those nights the quiet was heavier, as if the very air waited, tense and unyielding, for what was being done at the beach. He slipped along the familiar path, each step etched in memory, until the soft crunch of sand beneath his soles told him he was close. The glow was always there, faint at first, like fireflies trembling in the mist, and then stronger, resolving into hooded lanterns that moved with a purpose. The men worked in silence or with only murmurs, their dark figures bending and rising against the dull curve of the sphere. Sometimes their shadows stretched tall and distorted across the sand, and to the boy they looked like giants hunched over some monstrous egg, waiting for it to split open. He huddled among the rocks where the tide reached only at its fullest, hidden by shadow, his body trembling with cold and anticipation. He had been too young to witness anything like this before, and yet his heart told him he belonged in that moment, as though the secret unfolding belonged to him as much as it did to those grim-faced men. On that night, the atmosphere felt different. The men moved with more urgency, their voices low but sharper, their tools laid out with the precision of surgeons. David pressed himself flat to the stone, straining to hear. He caught fragments of unfamiliar words, phrases that meant nothing to him, but the tone was unmistakable. Tonight they expected to reach deeper than before. One of them crouched by the rusted seam he had seen opened the previous nights, and another placed a device with a faint buzzing hum against the metal. The sound carried across the still air, blending with the murmur of the waves, and David's stomach clenched as if the vibration ran through his own bones. There was a pause, a moment of utter stillness, and then a sharp metallic crack that seemed to split the silence. The seam widened, the panel shifted with a groan, and a dark hollow yawned open inside the sphere. David's eyes widened. He felt both terrified and elated, as though he had stumbled to the threshold of another world. The men leaned closer, their lights shining into the opening, revealing shapes and shadows that made his heart pound faster. One by one, they drew out objects. Not treasure, not weapons, but sealed containers, boxes wrapped with clasps that gleamed faintly under the lantern light. Each was handled with care, passed from one man to another, set gently into padded crates waiting nearby. David's curiosity burned hotter. What could possibly lie inside those boxes that demanded such secrecy? He pressed closer, willing himself not to breathe, his eyes fixed on the smallest of gaps between the men's bodies. At last, one of the containers was opened. The man who handled it used gloves, his movements cautious, deliberate. From within, he drew a packet of papers bound together with a strip of metal. The boy squinted, catching sight of dark lines across the pages. They were maps, though unlike any he had ever seen. Wavy lines marked coastlines, dotted with symbols, and across the top he could just make out words in a language he did not recognize, though his grandfather might have. Another man took the packet, holding it close to the lantern, his face grim as he read. More papers followed, then photographs, each sealed carefully in plastic to protect against decay. David saw glimpses of what they held. Tunnels stretching underwater, their walls gleaming with lights, heavy doors of steel marked with numbers, figures blurred and distant in corridors that looked like no ship he had known. His skin prickled, his mind racing with questions that no one could answer. Who had built such places? Why had their images been hidden inside a sphere left to rust beneath the sea? The men spoke more now, still low, but with a current of tension that made their words seem heavier. One pointed at a particular map, tapping with his finger, and though David could not hear what was said, he saw the seriousness in the others' faces. They were looking at something important, something dangerous perhaps, and the boy realized in that moment that this was not simply salvage from a forgotten war. It was a secret meant to remain buried, and the strangers had no intention of sharing it with the world. He felt both pride and despair. Pride because it was he who had found the sphere first, he who had uncovered the path to this mystery. Despair because he was only a boy, crouched in the shadows, powerless to claim what felt like his discovery. His chest tightened as he imagined walking out onto the sand, demanding to know the truth, but the thought of their cold eyes turning on him kept him still. The men worked until their crates were filled, then sealed the hatch once more. This time, David noticed the effort it took, the way the rusted metal resisted closing, as though the object itself resented being locked again. When it finally gave way with a heavy thud, the sound echoed across the beach like a drumbeat. The men lifted their cases and carried them up the path, their boots crunching softly, their lanterns dwindling into the night. The jeep was waiting, its engine coughing alive, and within moments the lights had vanished into the darkness, leaving the boy alone with the sea and the silent sphere. He remained there long after they had gone, his thoughts a whirlwind. The images burned into his mind. The tunnels, the doors, the maps with their strange markings refused to fade. He thought of his grandfather, of the stories he had told of wars and secrets, and he wondered if even Marco could explain this. He thought of the villagers, restless with rumors, and knew that none of them could guess what lay hidden in those crates now rolling away into the night. Only he had seen. Only he carried that knowledge, and though it filled him with awe, it also weighed heavy as stone upon his shoulders. The following days brought no relief. The strangers returned again and again, always at night, always carrying away more of what had been hidden inside. The villagers noticed the lights on the water, the glow of lanterns, the movement of shadowed figures, but they dared not approach. Fear kept them away, fear and the sense that the beach was no longer theirs. Only David slipped close enough to see, to watch as the mystery unfolded piece by piece until it consumed his thoughts entirely. It was after one such night, when the first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, that David made a decision. He could not remain a spectator forever. The secrets were too great, the weight of them too heavy. If he could not claim them openly, then he would claim them in silence, in memory. He would carry them within him until the time came when he could share them with someone who would understand. But for now, he would watch, he would listen, and he would learn. The world had shifted around him, and he felt himself shifting with it, no longer a boy chasing shells and driftwood, but a witness to a truth far larger than his small village could comprehend. The sea roared softly at his back as he stood there, staring at the sphere, and in its voice he thought he heard both warning and promise. The secret was not finished with him yet, and though the men with their lanterns and crates might believe they had claimed it, David knew deep inside that it still belonged to him in a way no one could take away. The nights of secret work had turned the village into a place of unease where sleep no longer brought rest, and the simple rhythm of life seemed broken beyond repair. Even those who pretended indifference could not ignore the glow of lanterns at the shore, the distant hum of engines, the occasional thud of metal that carried on the still air. Whispers passed from door to door, and though no one dared to approach the strangers, the weight of their presence pressed down upon every soul. David, who had seen more than anyone else, carried the heaviest burden of all. Each night he watched the men open the sphere, remove the sealed containers, and vanish into the dark with their cases full of secrets. Each dawn he returned home with eyes heavy from fatigue, yet his mind aflame with questions he could not share. It was on the 7th morning after the first opening that the change came. The day began like any other. The sea gray under a heavy sky, gulls crying hoarsely as they wheeled above the harbor. But before the boats had even pushed off, the sound of engines broke the air once more. This time it was not only a jeep and a truck, but larger machines, heavier, their growl echoing through the narrow lanes like thunder. The villagers came out of their homes, drawn by the noise, and gathered at the edges of the road. Dust rose behind the wheels as the convoy approached, carrying with it a sense of finality. The men who arrived wore the same plain clothes as before, yet their numbers had doubled, and with them came equipment none of the villagers recognized. Cranes mounted on the back of the trucks, thick cables coiled like snakes, crates of tools stacked neatly. David stood pressed against his grandfather's side, his stomach knotted. He knew instantly what this meant. The nights of quiet removal, the secrecy and caution had come to an end. The strangers had taken what they wanted from inside the sphere, and now they would take the sphere itself. The thought pierced him with grief so sharp it felt like loss. He could not explain why, but the object had come to feel like part of him, like something the sea had chosen to reveal only to him. To see it carried away, stripped from its resting place on the rocks, felt like betrayal. The men wasted no time. They marched to the shore, their boots trampling across the sand with heavy confidence. Ropes and pulleys were unrolled, clamps fastened to the metal ring at the top of the sphere, and the crane's arm groaned as it extended above the object. The villagers murmured in alarm, but none dared step forward. A few men clenched their fists, muttering about their rights, but fear outweighed anger. The strangers moved with too much certainty, their silence too commanding, as if they belonged not to the same world as the fishermen and their families, but to another where orders were given and obeyed without question. David could not take his eyes from the sphere. As the crane tightened its grip and the cables strained, the object shifted, breaking free from the embrace of the rocks that had held it for so long. Seaweed tore away from its sides, Water cascaded down in dark rivulets, and with a shudder it rose slowly into the air. The sound of its weight creaking against the chains filled the beach, drowning out the waves, and the boy's heart seemed to lift and sink with it. For the first time, he saw it entirely revealed, round and immense, its black surface scarred by rust and barnacles, its hidden seams faint but undeniable. It hovered for a moment, suspended like some great captured creature before being swung carefully onto the bed of the waiting truck. Gasps rose from the villagers as the sphere thudded down, secured with more ropes and chains. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers for protection, while others turned away, as though the sight was too much to bear. To see it lying on the truck, bound and helpless, stripped of mystery, was to see their fears made solid. David's throat tightened and his eyes burned, but he did not cry. He only stared, imprinting the image into his memory, vowing never to forget how it had looked when it left them. The men placed barriers around the beach, erecting tall signs that read in bold letters, "Prohibited Area." Beyond them, no villager was allowed to walk. Guards were stationed there for the rest of the day, their watchful eyes cold and impersonal. The children, who had once dared to sneak near the ropes, now stayed far away, their games muted, their laughter absent. The sea itself seemed quieter, as though mourning the theft of what it had once hidden. That night, the strangers were gone. Their vehicles had vanished down the road, the rumble of engines fading into memory, but the emptiness they left behind was worse than their presence. The beach, once the heart of the village, now felt abandoned and strange. The fishermen no longer launched their boats from there. They avoided the place altogether, choosing instead to drag their nets from farther down the coast. The warning signs stood like silent sentinels, reminders of what had been lost. David could not accept it. He walked to the edge of the barrier whenever he could, staring at the sand where the sphere had once rested, seeing in his mind the way it had gleamed under the moonlight, the way it had rocked gently when he first prodded it with a stick. He felt as though part of himself had been stolen, carried away in the bed of that truck, and he did not know how to fill the emptiness it left. The villagers spoke little of it now, their arguments exhausted, their spirits worn down. Some said it was better this way, that the thing had brought only trouble, that their lives could return to normal. But even as they said it, their eyes betrayed doubt. They knew, as David knew, that the village would never be the same. The sphere had changed them. It had awakened old fears, stirred old memories, and planted in their minds questions that would never be answered. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sea with fire, David sat beside his grandfather on the steps of their house. Marco smoked his pipe in silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. At last he spoke, his voice rough with age. He said that some things in this world were not meant to be explained, that sometimes it was enough to witness and remember. David wanted to protest, to shout that it was not enough, that he needed to know the truth, but the words died in his throat. He realized that his grandfather, too, carried the weight of secrets, that he had lived long enough to know the futility of chasing answers that powerful men would never share. Still, David could not let it rest. At night, he dreamed of the sphere, of the hidden hatch, of the maps and photographs glimpsed in the lantern light. He dreamed of tunnels stretching under the sea, of heavy doors locked against the world, of voices whispering in languages he did not understand. And always he woke with the same sense, that the story was not finished, that the object's disappearance was only the beginning of something larger. The beach lay empty, but the memory of the sphere remained, heavy as the tide, etched into every stone and every wave. David carried it within him, knowing that though the men had taken the object away, they could not take the truth of what he had seen. And as the weeks passed and the village slowly settled into uneasy quiet, the boy's resolve only hardened. One day he would learn the rest. One day he would uncover what had been stolen from him. The sea kept its secrets, but he had seen enough to know they were real, and that knowledge would never let him go. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying with it both forgetfulness and remembrance, smoothing over the sharp edges of grief, yet leaving behind the weight of certain memories that refused to fade. The beach where the sphere had once rested was no longer closed, but neither was it the same place it had been before. The warning signs had been taken down after months of silence. The guards long vanished, and fishermen eventually returned to launch their boats once more. Yet an unease lingered like salt crusting on the stones, an unspoken agreement that the land had been touched by something beyond them, and that nothing could truly erase it. David grew taller, his shoulders broadening, his features sharpening into those of a young man. He worked with his father on the sea, learned to mend nets, to read the weather and the patterns of clouds, to guide a boat through dangerous currents. Outwardly, he became like the other men of the village, another son of the ocean who earned his bread with patience and sweat. But within him burned the same flame that had ignited when he first saw the black curve of the sphere among the moss and stones. The images remained sharp in his mind, the seam opening with a groan, the maps marked with strange symbols, the photographs of tunnels lit by pale lamps. They haunted his dreams and colored his waking thoughts. The villagers, in time, wrapped the memory in layers of rumor until the truth was hidden even from themselves. To some, the sphere had been a mine, dangerous and unstable, taken away to protect them. To others, it was a piece of lost treasure, its riches spirited off by outsiders who had stolen what should have belonged to the village. There were those who spoke of curses, insisting that the strange illnesses and misfortunes that had followed in later years were proof that the sea had punished them for disturbing what lay beneath. Stories grew and twisted, repeated to children who had not even been born when the sphere was found, until the object became more myth than memory. But David remembered with a clarity none of the others shared, because he had been there, hidden among the rocks, watching with eyes wide and heart racing as the men worked under cover of night. He knew what they had taken, even if he did not yet understand its meaning. When he walked among his neighbors and heard their tales, he stayed silent, never correcting them, never revealing what he knew. His grandfather had taught him that some truths were too dangerous to speak, and he had come to understand the wisdom of that. The men who had come were powerful, the kind of men who could close beaches, erect barriers, and take away whatever they desired without question. To defy them would have been folly. Yet silence did not ease the weight within him. Years passed, and still he found himself drawn to the shoreline in the quiet of early mornings, just as he had when he was a boy. The beach had changed, but in the wash of waves against the rocks and the cry of gulls overhead, he could still hear echoes of the day when he had first stumbled upon the gleaming shape half buried in moss. Sometimes he stood for long hours, staring at the sea, imagining the roads the truck had taken as it carried the sphere away, imagining where it lay now, hidden in some vault, or perhaps sunk once more beneath the ocean where no one would find it. A statue now stood at the harbor, placed there by officials who had returned years later with grand words about remembrance. It was a replica of the sphere, polished and clean, its surface smooth and unmarked by rust or barnacles. To the tourists who occasionally visited the village, it was a curiosity, a monument to some obscure history. They posed beside it for photographs, laughing, unaware of what it truly represented. For the villagers, it was both a symbol of pride and a scar, a reminder of what had been taken from them. For David, it was neither. It was a hollow shadow, an insult even, for it lacked the weight, the mystery, the quiet menace of the real object. Yet he visited it often, unable to resist the pull, standing before it in silence as he remembered. Sometimes, when the harbor was quiet and the wind carried only the sound of waves against the shore, old men gathered near the statue and whispered to one another. They spoke of documents hidden in the sphere, of maps that showed things meant never to be found, of tunnels beneath the sea where doors of steel still waited to be opened. Their voices carried the thrill of fear, as though even now, long after the object was gone, the secrets it contained might reach out and touch them. David listened from a distance, his face unreadable, his thoughts his own. He knew they guessed only fragments, and that what he had seen was greater than they imagined. He wondered often about the photographs sealed in plastic, about the words printed across the papers in a language he had not understood. He wondered about the tunnels and the doors, about the light that had glowed inside them as though someone had walked there recently, not decades ago. Most of all, he wondered why such things had been hidden inside a sphere and left beneath the water until the tide had delivered it to him. Questions pressed against his mind like waves against stone, relentless and unsatisfied. But life had its own demands, and David could not spend all his days chasing mysteries. He worked hard, cared for his family, lived as the others did. Yet the secret was always there, a current beneath the surface of his days, shaping the man he became. He was quieter than the others, more thoughtful, his eyes always searching the horizon as though expecting to see something rise again from the depths. Some called him a dreamer. Others said he carried too much of his grandfather's restless spirit. He did not mind. They could not know the truth that lay within him, nor the weight of what he remembered. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he took out a scrap of paper where he had copied as best he could the outline of one of the maps he had glimpsed. The memory was imperfect, but the image had burned itself into his mind strongly enough that he could draw its rough lines. A single mark deep under the sea, near a place the men had called Cape Zora. He kept it hidden, folded in cloth, as though it were a treasure. Perhaps, one day, it would lead him to answers, or perhaps it was only a reminder of a boy's curiosity. Yet, he guarded it fiercely, the last fragment of the mystery that was truly his own. The sea went on, eternal, indifferent. Storms came and went, the tide rose and fell, and the years turned like the pages of a book. But for David, the day he had first seen the sphere remained vivid, unchanged, as though carved into his soul. He could still feel the damp moss under his bare feet, still hear the hollow echo when his stick struck the metal, still taste the fear and wonder that had filled his chest. It had been the beginning of something, though he still did not know what. Perhaps it had been the beginning of his own life as he truly knew it, the day when he stepped beyond childhood and into the long shadow of secrets that stretched far beyond his village. Standing at the harbor before the statue, the sea wind tugging at his clothes, David often felt that the real sphere was not gone at all. It was still with him, carried not in trucks or locked in hidden vaults, but inside himself, in the unshakable knowledge that the world held mysteries larger than any man could grasp. He felt both burdened and blessed by that truth. Burdened because it had set him apart from others, marked him with a weight no one else shared. Blessed because he had been chosen, if only for a moment, to glimpse what lay hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary world. And so he lived on, working, waiting, remembering, always drawn back to the sea. For he knew deep in his bones that the story was not finished. The ocean never surrendered all its secrets at once. One day, perhaps in his lifetime, perhaps in another's, something else would wash ashore, and another boy or another man would stand where he had once stood and feel the same shiver of awe. The sea would always whisper its riddles, and those who listened closely enough would hear. Until then, David carried the memory, faithful as the tide, silent as the depths, a witness to the mystery that had changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click now to watch more shocking videos just like this one, each more incredible than the last. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends and see how they react.